When you hear the word trafficking, do you automatically think of actual traffic and movement? Does someone have to be moved from one country to another or from state to state to be considered a human trafficking victim? We'll discuss all this and more on today's Dragonfly Human Trafficking Podcast.
Hi everyone, this is Whitney, the Executive Director of the Dragonfly Home.
And hello, I'm Melissa, the Director of Communications and Development for the Dragonfly Home.
Welcome to today's episode of the Dragonfly Human Trafficking Podcast. In honor of Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we are addressing our month-long campaign, Getting to the Truth, Common Misconceptions About Human Trafficking. Today we're talking about our second misconception.
Yeah, our second misconception is that trafficking requires travel and involves transportation. And the truth that we're going to be discussing is, although the term trafficking seems to imply movement, the law does not require that victims be moved across state or country lines to meet the criteria for trafficking. People can be trafficked in their hometown or even in their own house.
And right, so on Misconception 1, we talked about the definition of trafficking. So really, when we get hotline calls or we're working with victim survivors of trafficking, we're really looking to see, was there some kind of exploitation? So was there this third party who was controlling this individual, using force, fraud, or coercion to induce them to perform a sex act or labor? Or is this person under the age of 18 in the commercial sex instance? So I think so often we see in trainings that people believe they're looking for this kidnapping or they're looking for the traveling across state lines, when in fact the definition really covers this exploitation.
Mm-hmm. I know I've heard people say because the word traffic is literally in the word and we associate that automatically with movement. I mean, it makes sense that people would think that. And then like we addressed also last time, we talked about how victims of human trafficking don't have to be from some other country. They don't have to be moved from country to country. They're from our state. They're from our hometown. There's no movement required there.
Right. And so I read this interesting study recently, and it was talking about trafficking survivors and what they believed. And so many times we get these, again, hotline calls, and we rarely hear that victims would self-identify as trafficking victims. So this study indicated that even those who were, involved in the commercial sex trade and had a controller, they believed that they were only being trafficked when they were moved across state lines, which was really interesting. Another thing that we see quite often in Oklahoma, we see kind of the usage of smuggling and human trafficking used interchangeably, when really they're two totally separate crimes. Smuggling is a crime against a country's border, and trafficking is, again, the crime of exploitation against a person. So they're different crimes, and we do recognize that a lot of victim survivors that we've helped may have been initially smuggled into the country, leaving them in a very vulnerable spot. Perhaps sometimes not being able to speak English or not having the proper documentation, and so they're taken advantage of.
And maybe the way that a trafficker kind of gets a hold of them, gets control of them, is by saying, you now owe me for smuggling you into this country, so you have to do this, whether it's labor or sex trafficking, until you pay off this debt.
Yeah, definitely.
But still, those are two totally different crimes. Something else that you hear about quite often, I feel like we hear about this in Oklahoma, but now we're realizing that people in pretty much every state are saying this about their state. People talk about how the highway system really affects the level of trafficking in their state. Here where we're located in Oklahoma City, we have I-35 and I-40, which intersect. So you have I-35, which goes from Mexico to Canada, and then I-40, which goes from coast to coast. So people say, well, that has to increase the level of human trafficking in our state, right? Because people are being brought in. Well, I'm from Des Moines, Iowa, and I-35 and I-80 cross. There you have the exact same situation. But it's not necessarily the main factor in determining whether human trafficking happens or how much human trafficking happens.
Right. And we know that the highway system certainly helps traffickers. run their business more efficiently and effectively because they are able to, and we've heard this from victim survivors, they often move on circuits throughout the country. But if we're just looking at blaming the highway system or saying that that's the reason why trafficking is happening, that really simplifies a very complex issue. And so in Oklahoma, and I'm sure that you can identify things in other states, in your own state, we talk about some of the vulnerabilities. So we know that traffickers prey upon vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities in Oklahoma could be vulnerabilities created by the level of incarcerated women in the country,
Or
right?
drug use, poverty.
Children in foster care.
Education is extremely important.
Rates of mental illness.
And also things like rates of domestic violence, sexual assault. So all of those do create vulnerabilities, whether it makes somebody desperate, they really need help, or they're looking for an escape, they're looking to get out. If someone can come along and offer a solution for their problems, or even just offer love, affection, then that makes that person vulnerable.
Yeah. And so when we talk about trafficking requiring travel and involving transportation, we do know that that occurs. However, this strong common theme that we see amongst the people that we've been able to help really revolve more around the trauma that they've been through in the past. So we have to acknowledge that trauma has occurred, that hard things have occurred, and not just put it on kind of this, this outside thing. And we see too, I think we talked about before, in instances of familial trafficking, so many of these victim survivors who were caught up in familial trafficking where they're sold by maybe a parent or an uncle or a grandparent or whomever, sometimes they're sold right out of their own homes, or they're sold to neighbors, or they're sold to, people locally. So that doesn't, again, require any travel or transportation.
One young woman who our Dragonfly Home staff helped had experience with this, and we're actually talking about her story throughout this series. We're calling her Ashley to protect her privacy. We mentioned her in our first podcast about how she was from Oklahoma and she was trafficked here in Oklahoma. And her story, just different aspects of her story, touch on every single misconception and the truth about those misconceptions. And a part of her story is that she's from Oklahoma City and recruited and trafficked right here in Oklahoma City. So her trafficker, who we call Chris, she considered him her boyfriend. That is the relationship that he established with her right from the start. And we're going to go into that a little more later on in our podcast series. But the important thing to note for this one is that once he was able to really lure her in, kind of get her over on his side, develop that relationship, and really win her trust, the way that he started building this in her was he started having her strip in order to lower her inhibitions and kind of get her into the mentality of trafficking. And that was at a place in Oklahoma City.
Yeah, so Chris used this strategy that we commonly see where he's pretending to be the boyfriend, somebody that loves and cares for her, somebody that is filling the gaps, what she's looking for, this validation, this attention. And he is saying, hey, baby, help us. We need to pay the bills. We want to get married someday. You're a part of this team. And so the young woman really believes that she's doing a favor for somebody that she loves. And so even if this is something that the girl never thinks that she would ever do in her life, she feels almost obligated. It's like this psychological coercion, this obligation to try to make this relationship work and to not disappoint the boyfriend and to kind of increase that love between them.
Mm-hmm. So then after, getting her sort of comfortable in the world of commercial sexual exploitation, then he gradually began introducing her into the life of sex trafficking. And that was happening really right in her hometown. She never was trafficked outside of the greater Oklahoma City metropolitan area. There was no traveling to another country, traveling to another state, or really even necessarily another city. It was right where she was from. In our next podcast, we are going to be talking about whether or not somebody is usually trafficked by a complete stranger. If you've been listening to our past couple podcasts, you might be able to see where we're going with this. So we'll get more into the relationship that Chris built with Ashley next time. But before we wrap this up, we do want to mention that January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. That's why we're doing this. This is kind of a special series specifically because we are doing this campaign during Human Trafficking Awareness Month, clearing up common misconceptions about human trafficking. We also have a couple events coming up that we would love to invite you to if you're in the Oklahoma City area, or hey, maybe you're going to be in the Oklahoma City area and you would like to attend. You never know.
Right. So January 11th is Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and we'll have a community rally around 6 o'clock at Cork and Beans Coffee in Edmond. January 27th, we will be holding a statewide candlelight vigil. So I really hope that you all are able to join us to attend one of these events or see what else is going on in your area.
Yeah, it's going to be a really good month. I mean, if you're interested in human trafficking, this really is a great month to get involved more.
Thank you so much for listening in.
At the Dragonfly Home Human Trafficking Relief and Restoration Center, victim survivors of human trafficking from Oklahoma and beyond can find help to get a fresh start in life. Our mission is to provide non-residential services, intensive case management, and crisis intervention in a comfortable, home-like setting where victim survivors can access comprehensive services tailored to each individual. We also offer assistance and resources through our 24-hour confidential human trafficking helpline. The Dragonfly Home is a 501c3 nonprofit organization and is state certified by the Oklahoma Office of the Attorney General. For more information, visit www.thedragonflyhome.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.